Recording in progress.
Good evening, dear Thai. Good evening, dear Sangha. Welcome, Ashley. Welcome, Bradley. Welcome, Debbie. Welcome, Jill. Welcome, Nicole. Welcome, Rhonda. Welcome, Susan. Thanks for joining Thousand Trees tonight. So, I asked to kind of fit into this sharing spot for a couple of reasons. I've always lived my life kind of by the motto, I would never be part of a club that would have me as a member. And part of what that means to me is that I tend to live on a bit of the edge of things. I always poke the bear a little bit, and the reason why I'm poking the bear at this particular time is one of the other things about me is that as I personally make major life transitions or have major life events come up, I like to leave things out on the field, so to speak. And so tonight I was hoping to be able to do that because tomorrow morning I go in for heart surgery, and so that's a thing for tomorrow, and it's kind of a big deal. It's one I've been waiting for a little while, but also just I'm closing a bit of a chapter on an area of life and a time of my life, not to do with Sangha and not to do with Buddhism, but just in my personal life. I have a major chapter changing in the next couple of weeks as I move from my house and sort of move on from an era of my life that has been it's been particularly difficult and has been there's been some challenges. So tonight it's kind of inspired by what a couple of folks had told me. They went to Day of Mindfulness at the Westlock Meditation Center. I think it was at the Westlock Meditation or it was at the monastery. I can't remember which. In town, and somebody had asked one of the brothers a question, is white people practicing Buddhism, does that amount to cultural appropriation? And I wasn't there, so I didn't hear the answer. The piece of the answer I did hear is that the brother responded, well, Buddhism is made up of non-Buddhist elements. And I didn't hear if there was any other parts of the answer, but that's one of the common answers that Thai would certainly give people who asked similar questions, not only of Buddhism, but also of Christianity. And sort of gives a clue as to where I might be going with the first part of this talk, which is what we're doing cultural appropriation in practicing Buddhism, which comes from the Asian continent. Are we, I myself, I'm a cisgendered white male living in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. That's I'm of a certain subset, you could say, in terms of my background and how I grew up in life, and so there's a question there, and it's a question that's being asked not only of Buddhism, it's actually being asked in other areas. Yoga, for instance, a big question in the yoga circle, is practicing yoga cultural appropriation? So I'm going to share my thoughts, and they're just my thoughts, sort of building off what the brother said, but also adding in some other components. And part of this for me is when I heard that the question had been asked and answered, I kind of hearkened back to my Soto Zen practice. And I've never encountered it, I shouldn't say never. I have not frequently encountered this particular question in the Plum Village tradition since I've been practicing. I've been practicing in the tradition for 4 years as of January. And I've never really heard it asked of the Plum Village tradition, probably because of the nature of the community and Thai's approach to teaching Buddhism. But in specifically the Soto Zen, Japanese Soto Zen community, the question has been asked mainly in the U.S. because that's where Soto Zen has flourished in North America. Is it time for, in that case, an American Zen? Meaning cutting ties, the cultural ties to Japan, in a sense, and adopting an American form of practicing Buddhism in terms of dress, in terms of ceremony, in terms of not getting rid of the teachings of Buddhism and not disconnecting from the lineage, but being in a form, a different form, a uniquely American. And so the question that I asked tonight, just because, I'm in Canada, there's a similar question. Is it time for Canadian Buddhism? Buddhism arrived in Canada probably about the same time as in the States. It was the late 18th century, the late 19th century, and arrived via, in the Canadian case, Chinese immigrants and later Japanese immigrants, and then immigrants from other areas, and was slowly integrated into the population. The tradition of Buddhism slowly spread, and so it's been a legitimate question in many Zen circles, and a very sensitive one, because we'll get into that a little bit. But I want to talk about the first part of, the first question, the first part A of the question that I posed tonight, is what we're doing cultural appropriation. In practicing Buddhism, is it cultural appropriation? And building off of what Brother had said in his talk, I think it's important to turn to a definition of what cultural appropriation is. So there's a couple of different definitions that I pulled out. The first is, cultural appropriation is the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, ideas of one people or society by members of another, and typically more dominant people or society. The second definition was the adoption of an element or elements of culture or identity by members of another culture or identity in a manner perceived as inappropriate or unacknowledged. Opponents of cultural appropriation see it as an exploitative means in which cultural elements are lost or distorted as they are removed from their originating cultural contexts. Cultural elements that may have a deep meaning in the original culture may be reduced to exotic fashion or toys by those from the dominant culture. And this is the reason, if you looked at the Facebook group I used, you probably couldn't tell exactly where it's from. It being Halloween, there's a company, I don't know if you have it in the States, but there's a company called Spirit Halloween in Canada. And Spirit Halloween has gotten into trouble over the years because of some of the costumes that they have had on the shelf, and they've been accused of basically trading on cultural appropriation memes, which is where the picture was for the Facebook post that I had there. If you look there, it's a costume that a company was selling, and which is often been called out as a form of cultural appropriation. So that's the definition or definitions of cultural appropriation that I found. And looking into this, I also looked at a different definition for a different term, which was cultural diffusion, or expansion diffusion. And that goes as follows. Cultural diffusion is an innovation or idea that develops in a source area and remains strong there, while also spreading outwards to other areas. Cultural diffusion is the natural spread of cultural traits between societies, while appropriation is the adoption of those traits, often from a marginalized culture, by a dominant one without understanding, credit, or respect, leading to potential harm. Diffusion can be a positive process of cultural exchange and blending, while appropriation is typically negative because it can reinforce stereotypes, trivialize sacred items, and cause harm. The key difference lies in power dynamics, respect, and context. Diffusion is a broad process, and appropriation is a specific type of diffusion that can be exploitative. So, I'm just going to leave this as a question. Based on that definition, is what we are doing cultural appropriation? Or would it perhaps be the adoption of an expanding cultural diffusion. One of the comments that's often given in response to asking whether Buddhism is culturally appropriated in the West is to remember that Buddhism did not originate in Japan. It did not originate in Vietnam. It did not originate in China. It originated in India, and the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama were taking into consideration the questions of his culture as much as individual enlightenment. If we're culturally appropriating Buddhism, does that mean that Japanese and Vietnamese Buddhism culturally appropriated Chinese Buddhism? Did Chinese Buddhism culturally appropriate Indian Buddhism? As the brothers said, Buddhism is made up of non-Buddhist elements, just as Christianity is made up of non-Christian elements, which is something Tai said repeatedly. Each culture that has the core teachings of Buddhism, as the core teachings of Buddhism, they encountered them, they integrated their own cultural, historical, and psychological understandings with those core teachings. So, for instance, it's why Japanese Buddhism is different from Chinese Buddhism. Buddhism made contact with the cultural and religious perspectives of Japan, such as Shinto, to form Japanese Buddhism. It's why Tibetan Buddhism is so different from other forms of Buddhism. Buddhism dialogued with Bon, the indigenous religion of Tibet, and then we see Tibetan Buddhism. This isn't cultural appropriation. In fact, I would argue this is normal. Every culture in every place on earth that contacts another culture has influence on each other. And inevitably and invariably, there will be a sharing over periods of time. In the Western perspective, this is very evident when you look at Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism is not the same as original Christianity from the first century. Rome Romanized Christianity as a digestible substitute into the cultural, political, and administrative needs as a replacement for the collapse of the Roman pantheon. The same occurred in Egypt with Coptic Christianity and also Gnostic Christianity. None of these instances are appropriation in the negative sense that we define today. When we practice Buddhism in Sangha, we aren't doing it as a Halloween costume or as a joke to make fun of anybody. One might make some arguments about certain commercial aspects of Buddhism that have been adopted in the Americas, such as selling Dharma transmission for thousands of dollars, which has happened, and whether that is cultural appropriation or not. But that's not what we're doing here, at least not to my view. In my view, we acknowledge and value our roots. We try to maintain the tradition and the teachings as best we can, and that's not appropriation, in my view. That's accepting a new spiritual ancestorship, just as Tai did when he adopted Jesus and Christianity as his spiritual ancestors. You know, there's a story that I heard once from a famous Zen teacher in the States, and he was living in Japan in the 80s, and he tells the story about going into a Chinese food restaurant in Japan. And this person came in who was very clearly a Buddhist monk, but he was in civilian, but he had the bald head and everything. And he sat down at a table in the Chinese food restaurant, and he struck up a conversation with the owner of the Chinese food restaurant, who was a Buddhist from China. And through the course of the conversation, the owner of the restaurant exploded on this guy and told him to get out because he is a Japanese Buddhist monk, and in her view, that was an appropriation of Chinese Buddhism, and he should get out of the restaurant immediately. So this isn't. I say that because there's a question of even amongst as Buddhism diffused through Asia. There have been, this question is as old as the hills in terms of whether Buddhism has been appropriated by different cultures as it has gone along. But I've given you sort of a perspective that I had. So leaving that, then one of the questions that comes up that's sort of tangential to this is if when Buddhism went from India to China, over time there became a Chinese Buddhism. As Chinese Buddhism went to Japan and Vietnam and to other places, there became Japanese Buddhism and Vietnamese Buddhism. And so the question is it time for something like a Canadian Buddhism or an American Buddhism to come onto the scene? It's been here for over a century, different schools, but many of the teachings are very much the same. Over time, as Buddhism migrated, new symbols and Buddhist cultural artifacts developed in the cultures that it had contact with. It is the history and methodology of Buddhism to adapt its style and focus to the signs of the times. When Indian Buddhism came to China, it was very important that it was accepted as legitimate by the Chinese imperial court. And that influenced the intellectual tradition of Buddhism. In Japan, Zen aesthetics was incredibly influenced by Shinto and Japanese cultural perspectives on nature. For Thai, the Plum Village tradition could not but have been incredibly influenced by the war in Vietnam and the immense cultural impact that had upon him and the other founding members of that community. American Buddhism, especially Zen, was highly influenced by the culture in the United States at the time of its introduction in the 60s, arguably, especially during the time of civil rights, Watergate, the Vietnam War, etc. So the question is of whether there should be an American or a Canadian Zen has really arisen over the last couple of decades, as that generation of American teachers who were direct recipients of Japanese Zen teachers in the 60s start to retire and transition. Is it disloyal to talk about an American Buddhism or a Canadian Buddhism? I will tell you that in preparing for this talk, I was made aware that there were some people very uncomfortable with the idea that I was bringing this up. So there is that sense in some circles that it is disloyal or schismatic or something else. There's another story of an American who went to Japan to be ordained. And when he went to a monk and asked him to ordain him, the monk said, "Why?" And the American thought, oh, well, it's this esoteric question, it's this koan, it's this great mysterious answer that I must provide to the monk. And so the guy apparently started off as if he was answering a koan. And the monk said, no. Why? Why do you want to ordain? This is a Japanese Buddhist school. Why the hell do you as an American want to ordain as a monk in a Japanese school? Go to America, make your own monastic school. So there's a perception of a cultural element in many of the schools of Buddhism, and this isn't such a far-fetched idea or question to be asked, that as Buddhism grows and develops in different cultures that it comes in contact with, that they would come up with their own unique blend and character and form of how to express it. Shohaku Okumura, who some of you may have heard, very famous Zen teacher in the United States, has a perspective on this, and I'm going to share the video on it.
In order to make Buddhism into American for really American peoples, it should be Americanized, and that is not wrong or a bad thing. When Buddhism went from India to China, Chinese Buddhism is a little different from Indian Buddhism. And when Buddhism or Zen is introduced from Korea or Japan, there's some transformation. I think it's kind of necessary, Buddhism, not only Zen, but Buddhism in general, become Americanized to make really teaching and practice for American people as an expression of American spirituality. But I hope the process of making really Americanized, I hope the process is slow, not too quick, because there are really Buddhism has a long history, and there are varieties in almost entire Asian countries, and there are very rich tradition in all of the traditions, and Soto Zen is one of them, or Zen in general is one of the traditions within Buddhism. If it's become Americanized too quickly, some very important things might be lost. So I hope American practitioners keep the connection or with Asian country, not only Japan, but then it's from Japan, Korea, China. So I think it's important to keep the connection and study the very important part of the teaching and practice. Then gradually to become American. If we, American people, make Americans and kind of artificially, it might become something. How can I say? Something important might be lost. So, as a process of what is the word, naturalization, I think it's important to be free from that tradition, and yet I hope the very essential point of tradition should be maintained.
Source to enhance.
In a sense, there already is a Canadian Buddhism. There already is an American Buddhism. That train has already left the station. Because every practitioner in Canada and every practitioner in the United States is a budding leaf on the next branch of Buddhism that is becoming Canadian Buddhism or American Buddhism. Buddhism is made up of non-Buddhist elements. The Plum Village tradition is made up of non-Plum Village elements. And I think that as a community, the community continues further on after Thai's transition, this is going to become even more the case. Thai himself embraced Buddha and Jesus as spiritual ancestors. One of the things that does not get talked about very often, although, is fundamentally Buddhist. Thai and our tradition, the Plum Village tradition, were actually very heavily influenced by French and mystical Catholicism. For people from that tradition, it's easy to discern through Thai's teachings. It was a huge part of the Vietnamese cultural discussion, certainly in the early and mid-20th century. So Okamura Roshi talks about the slow process of making an American Zen or a Canadian Zen. And in a way, Thai saw this decades ago and created a cultural adapter. You know, when you go to Europe or you go to, somewhere other than North America and you have one of those power adapters, because everybody's got different plugins, Europe, different places in Europe. That's kind of what I see Thai having done with the Plum Village tradition. He's kind of the international adapter from Vietnamese Buddhism to North America, to Europe, to different parts of the world. That's what he offered. And this began almost next year. It's the 60th anniversary of the Order of Interbeing, which Thai started. Interestingly enough, a lot of people don't know this. Thai actually wasn't even, he hadn't received transmission to the lamp when he started the Order of Interbeing. He wasn't a teacher yet. He became a teacher very shortly thereafter, but he actually wasn't when he ordained his first 6 students. I think that that's interesting too. Now, the charter of the Order of Interbeing, in my view, anticipates the question about new schools of Buddhism. And what it says is this: the Order of Interbeing seeks to realize the spirit of the Dharma in early Buddhism, as well as the development of that spirit through the history of the Sangha and its life and teachings in all Buddhist traditions. The Order of Interbeing considers all sutras, whether spoken by Buddha or compiled by latest Buddhist generations, as Buddhist sutras. It is also able to find inspiration from the texts of other spiritual traditions. It considers the development of original Buddhism into new schools of Buddhism a necessity to keep the spirit of Buddhism alive. Only by proposing new forms of Buddhist life can one help the true Buddhist spirit perpetuate. Many Buddhist schools, and I experienced this firsthand myself, pride themselves on being what are called antiquarian societies, devoted to preserving the practices of their tradition with as little variation as possible. And Buddhism becomes, in these cases, heavily devoted to preserving a national culture that the schools arise out of. Many in the Americas and Europe have often been only too happy to participate in that project. And it would not be unfair to argue that for some of us who are Americans or Canadians, we like to dive head first into these kinds of projects, almost with a fetishism. As one who used to be in a leadership position within what is arguably the world's largest antiquarian religious society, I can tell you from my personal experience, both the beauty and the dangers that lurk in that fanaticism of preservation. When one becomes devoted to preserving the way it was, the tradition risks stagnation and becomes merely a historical preservation society. Thai knew that and warned us not to go there. The Charter of the Order of Interbeing says, the Order of Interbeing rejects dogmatism in both looking and acting. It seeks all forms of action that can revive and sustain the true spirit of insight and compassion in life. It considers this spirit to be more important than any Buddhist institution or tradition. With the aspiration of a bodhisattva, members of the Order of Interbeing seek to change themselves in order to change society in the direction of compassion and understanding by living a joyful and mindful life. In a couple of episodes of the podcast, The Way Out is In, Brother Phapu provides practical examples of Thai's perspectives on the matter. In one episode, Brother Phapu was quoted Thai as saying, "If we're still wearing brown robes in 50 years and have not changed the way that we practice, we will have failed." In episode 91 of the podcast, Brother Phapu talks about this a little bit more, and I just want to share a little snippet from that episode.
Enhance our understanding of our times, right? And part of Thai's teaching to the monks and nuns is that a new order, so that there is a Dharma line that is unbroken. And this for me is really important as a monk. I take that on as a responsibility. Like when the Buddha became enlightened and talked about, gave his first Dharma talk about the Four Noble Truths, the Eight Noble Paths, people said like that's when the Dharma wheel was moved again. Right? It's a very beautiful saying. It's not when the Dharma wheel was started, because even the Buddha is a continuation of many teachers. And some have, I've heard this, and some said when Thai have brought mindfulness and become a teacher that is a refuge for many, it's like the Dharma wheel moves again. So it's like the transmission of the lineage of Buddhism, and I'm not talking about the lineage of Plum Village, the lineage of Buddhism continues to flow into the world. And Thai has already instructed us, like, Thai expect at one day and age, like, our form as a Plum Village monk will change also. Like he said, our robes, or the color of the robes. But he said this very beautifully. But when you go back to Vietnam, though, you can wear the brown robes and the traditional straw hats, because that is our roots from Vietnam. So it's like never to lose that root. But if, let's say, in my lifetime or in the next generation's lifetime, maybe what they will be wearing is not what I'm wearing today. And that is appropriate, because it is the evolution of an organism, of a body, of a religious, alive, spiritual dimension. So, like, who Thai is and who the spirit of what Thai has brought in, Thai marries so many traditions in the Plum Village tradition. Thai said, oh, you want Pure Land Buddhism? Here it is. But the Pure Land is here and now. Right? You can touch it here and now. Don't wait until you die to go into the Pure Land, because if you can't touch it while you're alive, I'm not sure you can arrive there when you die. And it's like traditional chanting, we got it here too. But okay, today we are bringing in also the Western manifestation, bring in the cello, bring in the violin, bring in the flute, bring in the instruments that was created from the ancestors of these lands. And when we have indigenous leaders come, teach us about your traditions, some of it we can apply it to the traditions that we have. So it is this like amazing foundation where flowers of different traditions can also take root and blossom here. And we do have the right to, when something is so off and something's like, oh no, that's not part of our tradition, but we honor it, we celebrate it, and you can do it over there though. You know, and I think it's important to define all of this. And it's when we learn about the Vinaya, which is like the laws of the monks and nuns, there's this thing as flexibility. We have to be open, but there are moments we have to be very rigid, because these are our boundaries as a monk and a nun. If we do this, we're not monk and nuns. So like there's this like dance between, and that's why I say it's hard to be a Buddhist, because it's like there's so much like list of things that we get to learn, but then the Zen master will say, and be open.
I just want to close with a couple of other thoughts, and we'll open it up. Every time a new school of Buddhism emerges, it is largely a change in the form, the container that conveys the teaching to be relevant to the times. This reflects cultural appropriateness, or one might say, a skillful means. The robe, which symbolizes the teachings of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas, is ever present in true Buddhism. But its shape changes, its color changes, who wears it changes, its fabric changes. But the robe persists. It is the robe that is the root of the tree, but it is ever growing with new boughs and branches. The lineage in the root is maintained, but the tree organically grows in new ways. This is what has happened over the last 2,600 years. So, should there be a Canadian branch of the Buddhism tree? Has the time come? Are we sufficiently ripe? Is there a need for a renewed form that can specifically become Canadian Buddhism? Why would we consider this? Is there a reason that Canadian Buddhism may actually be different from American Buddhism? And with that, I'm going to close up my sharing and open up to Dharma sharing. Thank you, everybody.